So, welcome everyone to today's session at CloudEight conference about Microsoft Teams and on-premises mailboxes. I'm very happy and pleased to be part of this community conference, and I'm lucky to see quite a few attendees to this session. And we will have quite an interesting session to look out for. But first of all, I want to thank all of our sponsors for this community conference. Without them, this conference would not been possible. So I would like to encourage you to visit the sites of our sponsors, just to give them appreciation for supporting this conference. I want to introduce myself. My name is Thomas Szczycki, and I'm a MVP for Office apps and services. I've authored 2 books about Microsoft 365 and for Exchange 2019. And if you want to reach out after the session, just get in contact with me using Twitter or my email address, or just connect via LinkedIn if you like. So the question is, why would you use Microsoft Teams with on-premises mailboxes? This is the overall question that, well, I sometimes do not really understand why companies still want to use on-prem Exchange, but I know that there are some reasons for that. Most we talk about compliance or regulatory requirements for keeping mailboxes on-prem. Some of the reasons are for the financial industry, energy sector, if you are a lawyer's office or just a company that is accustomed to the critical infrastructure, or kritis as we say in Germany, so that there are some legal requirements force you to stay with an on-prem organization. Sometimes you have contractual agreements with your customers as a company, where you ensure that certain data, and in this case, email, remains on premises and is not part of any cloud mailbox infrastructure. A simple thing is that you have backup requirements regarding email and mailbox information, and any other thing you can think of. Some companies remain on premises because of having trust issues with Microsoft as a cloud provider. But to be honest, in this case, I would challenge you and ask you the question if a cloud approach then So back again. Sorry for that, guys. I had a internet interruption, even though that I'm not using Wi-Fi. This is just a cable connection, but I got disconnected. Just a second, and we are good to go in a few moments. And I was talking about the on-premises mailboxes thing that, how does Microsoft Teams connect to your on-prem mailboxes? As mentioned, so when I was disrupted by the internet outage here, the Teams backend services connect to Exchange Online first because this is a reliable endpoint from a Teams backend services standpoint, because they Teams backend services just see this as a reliable endpoint, and it's a very fast and quick connection. They do an AutoDiscover request to Exchange Online. And in the case of an on-prem mailbox, Exchange Online knows about the on-premise mailbox of a user because there's a mail user object in Azure Active Directory. So a synchronized user from your on-prem Active Directory. You see the first requirement, you have to have Azure Active Directory Connect in place, and your on-prem mailbox information needs to be synchronized to Exchange Online. And in the case of a mail user, so the mailbox itself is located on premises, Exchange Online will respond to this request with an HTTP redirect providing the information, hey, this is the URL of the on-premises Exchange.org. Don't ask me, ask Exchange on-prem directly. And as a second step, backend services will query the on-prem org for the endpoint URL for EWS. So they do an AutoDiscover request, check for a user, hey, Exchange on-prem, please give me the EWS URL for this user. And after fetching this information as a third step, the backend services will then finally query the on-prem Exchange, fetch the calendar information, handle the information fetched from on-prem calendar mailbox, and provide it to the client. These are steps that, well, that looks pretty easy, aren't easy at all, because there are certain requirements in place that I already mentioned. First of all, you need to have Azure Active Directory Connect in place. This is one of the prerequisites. And the funny thing is that even though that Exchange provides up to 5 different ways to implement Exchange Hybrid, there's only one configuration option for Exchange Hybrid that works with Microsoft Teams. And this is the so-called classic full hybrid approach, which means that we need to have, as a full hybrid, mail flow in place, which is for Microsoft Teams not necessarily the stuff that we are looking for, but from a HTTPS access perspective, we need to publish our Exchange servers to the internet. And most likely, you use a reverse proxy publishing your on-prem Exchange server client access endpoints to the internet. You should never, ever publish your on-prem Exchange server as a domain member directly to the internet. And for sure, you would have firewalls in place. I just spared those to keep the diagram as simple as possible. And full hybrid means that your on-premises Exchange servers need to have access to Exchange Online as well. So these are the required communication directions that you need for a classic full hybrid. So these are the steps in a textual manner. Microsoft Teams does use something that is called AutoDiscover version 2. AutoDiscover v2 is an anonymous AutoDiscover request compared to the AutoDiscover version 1. So the AutoDiscover requests that we've done in the past, querying the EWS endpoint using the exchange.asmx file always uses authentication, but the AutoDiscover v2 is just an anonymous request querying an information, and it only responses with the information of a URL. So there's no personal information being part of such a anonymous request. So as mentioned before, if the Teams backend services query for a mailbox that is hosted in the cloud, the response of Exchange Online is always this URL. And at this step, the Teams backend service already have all the information they need. And they're done. In the case of an AutoDiscover redirect, the external address attribute of the mail user object is used to determine the endpoint for the redirect information. So this endpoint is part of the redirect, and the Teams backend services query for the information, get the URL, and we are done. You already see that using an on-premises mailbox with Microsoft Teams puts a little more overhead into it when it comes to the time required for fetching the information and displaying the calendar information in the Teams client. It's not as fast as it is for an Exchange Online mailbox. And this is only the process for getting to the endpoint. We are not even talking about what happens and what is the performance impact from your on-premises Exchange server for providing this information. Meaning, if your on-premises Exchange server infrastructure is behaving very badly, so it does not have the performance resources required to act accordingly, it might take some time until calendar information shows up in Microsoft Teams. So what are your stumbling blocks when you want to stay with on-premises Exchange server and keeping your mailbox service on-prem? You have to have at least something called Exchange Server 2016 Cumulative Update 3, which, well, this is the minimum requirement for such implementation, but these days, saying June 2021, you would never ever have 2016 CO3 in place, but most likely, due to the security situations we faced earlier this year, you're already patched up to the latest cumulative update plus the security patches, right? But the CO3 is required because this brought us AutoDiscover v2 support to Exchange Server 2016. And yeah, Exchange Server 2019 already has this support built in, which means if you're still on Exchange Server 2010, which you shouldn't be for various reasons, you can't use Microsoft Teams with your on-prem Exchange org. You have to upgrade your on-premises Exchange organization. Most likely from 2010 to 2016, and then to 2019, or whatever your migration path will be, right? The Exchange Server Support Lifecycle document provides you with the appropriate information, how you can upgrade, and what would be your options for updating and upgrading your infrastructure to the appropriate version. The required links to those informations is part of a resource slide at the very end of the presentation. So it's part of the slide deck that you can get afterwards. What is the second stumbling block when using Microsoft Teams on-premises mailboxes? Yeah, it's hybrid identities. There are certain technical options how you can get this to work without a hybrid, but I want to talk about the supported way to do things. And therefore, it's implementing hybrid identities with Azure AD Connect, and especially using Azure AD Connect with the Exchange hybrid option enabled. Because this ensures that the Active Directory information that is that holds the information that a user object does have an on-prem mailbox is then synchronized to Azure Active Directory and then transferred to the Exchange Online directory system. And so the Exchange Online knows that this user is not only a hybrid user, a hybrid identity, but that this hybrid identity does have an existing on-prem mailbox. This is the way how a on-premises mailbox show up as a mail user object in Exchange Online. And this is very important for this. So this is why you might face issues where a Teams user cannot access an on-prem mailbox properly because this information is not then synchronized fully using Azure AD Connect. Another thing that is pretty obvious to most of you, but is sometimes forgotten about, mostly forgotten about due to quote unquote security requirements, because a non-published DNS record is a security feature. No, it's not. It's just a technical limitation which drives administrators in the case of identifying a failure really nuts. So we need to have proper DNS resolution in place. All the endpoints that you use must be part of your external DNS zone, and they must be resolvable reliably. And do not forget about keeping those DNS IP addresses, as names and IP addresses, correctly updated in the case when you, as an example, move from internet provider A to internet provider B. I've already seen quite a few with a few customers that they just forgot about to update all of the endpoints. Besides name resolution and external DNS zones, we are talking about potential client string filtering. Some companies use on their inbound, let's say in the reverse proxy or any other fancy active network device, as I call them, user agent string filtering to limit access to mailboxes, just to ensure that only or that the access using HTTPS is handled in a controlled manner for certain user strings. In this case, I recommend to not use user string filtering because it's not a really good security feature at all, right? And sometimes the queries from the Teams backend service to on-prem Exchange just die on the way due to client string filtering. What is a stumbling block? The fourth stumbling block in this case, it's just not properly configured on-prem Exchange log. In this case, we are talking about the virtual directory URL settings for the external URLs of all of your virtual directories. You must ensure that the external URL settings are set correct across all Exchange servers, because the AutoDiscover v2 provides this URL back to the query from the Teams backend services, and this URL must be the one that is external resolvable using DNS and accessible for the Teams services. Some companies restrict the inbound HTTPS requests to the Teams and Skype for Business IP address ranges that are published in the Office 365 IP address ranges page. I recommend just to start with limiting this access after you've ensured that your access is working. Otherwise, you might get in some issues, where you do not know why things aren't working. Is it due to IP address filtering or what? Open authentication, OAuth, is the next stumbling block that you need to be aware of, because OAuth is used after all the anonymous AutoDiscover request to access the on-premise Exchange organization. And OAuth must be configured correctly. The easiest way to handle things is to establish the Exchange hybrid configuration using the hybrid configuration wizard. As mentioned, this is the easiest way. the Exchange product group does have or has published a Microsoft Docs article about how you can configure open authentication manually without HCW. But the easiest way, and for the most of us, is to use HCW. Delegate access. When it comes to delegate access with Teams, you must know that a delegate can only access a manager's mailbox if the delegate permission has been given using the Outlook delegate permission wizard. Just adding a user to the permissions list of the calendar folder is not sufficient, because when it comes to creating a new Teams meeting as a delegate in a manager's calendar, the Teams backend service query the delegate list. So, and the delegate list contains only the persons that are configured as a delegate for that specific user. It sounds pretty obvious, but we all know that Outlook is a client that gives end users numerous options to create permissions for other users in their mailbox, right? So if just check if you see any issues, just that the delegate permission is configured using the delegate wizard. Now, quite a technical diagram. You already seen how the Teams backend, Teams services connect to or query Exchange Online, do AutoDiscover, get the redirect, then get to the on-prem org and fetch the mailbox information. But this is where it gets really tricky, because let's say the Teams backend services connect to or want to connect to a mailbox using EWS. If you're familiar with Exchange Server or a modern Exchange Server, starting with Exchange Server 2013, you know that we do have something called a client access front end and the mailbox component, which for 16 and Exchange Server 2019 is just a single server, so not a role separation across servers. But the connection comes to the Exchange front end, also into the Internet Information Services, then reaches the Exchange component itself, which is in this case the EWS proxy component. So nothing really happens here, but authentication. And then the proxy component proxies this connection to the backend, right? To the mailbox layer where all the business logic lies. So we come from TCP for classic HTTPS on 443. We are proxy to 444. And in this case, we then end, and this final step in the EWS endpoint, and in this EWS component is all the magic of Exchange Server fetching the information requested by the EWS request, which is pretty easy if you are in a single server environment. So troubleshooting is easy because everything happens on the same server. But what about a multi-server environment? Because your request can reach server A, but is proxy to server B, because server B is the server that holds the exchange, the mailbox of the user, where you want, where the Teams backend service need to get information from. In this case, you have connections coming in from the internet via some sort of network connection inbound to your Exchange servers, and then are proxied across multiple servers. And think about an infrastructure where we are not talking about just two servers, but multiple. So troubleshooting gets pretty ugly. Another thing that you need to be aware of is any active network component in the way between the Teams backend services and your Exchange service. Yes, we always start with the firewall. Modern firewalls are capable of providing some sort of URL filtering. So ensure that all the proper URLs say, virtual directory of AutoDiscover, virtual directory for EWS, the virtual directory for API, so for the REST endpoint, and so on, are accessible and published. Be aware of reverse proxy configurations. Intrusion, yeah, I should have written it correct. It should be an S instead of a T. Intrusion detection, load balancer. Some companies use TLS proxies, or think of any other Active Directory device that is between Office 365 and your internal Exchange servers. Those servers those components can be a hassle and bring additional complexity to to your environment. Let's see. So are there certain things that do not work with Microsoft Teams, or let's say Microsoft 365 and an on-premises mailboxes that you should be aware of? Absolutely, because you do not have access to your personal contacts in your personal mailbox on-prem. Teams is just not designed to work that way. You do not have access to any other calendar in your mailbox. To-do and bookings do not work or do only work with an Exchange online mailbox. This is something you should be aware of. All right. So let's see if we had. So CE. Yeah, due to the small audience in this call, I'd like to ask you if you have any questions regarding our on-prem mailboxes and Microsoft Teams. Do you have any reasons that you think that are viable reasons for companies to stay on-prem with this change, but still using Teams? Or Drago is right. So, Adam, I think Adam, should be able to come on off mute if you like, but you can write in chat as well.
Yeah, you can. I was just presenting earlier as well, so I'm a presenter, but I think everyone is. It seems like that. A great session. I was just dealing with a lot of this kind of problem because I have a customer that's very like, they don't want to have anything in the cloud, but I want to use Teams, right? So they've like locked down everything, collaboration, creating teams and stuff like that, but they wanted to have meetings. And so we set up a hybrid so they could have meetings and restricted everything else. But then they were like, yeah, but since we can see the calendar in Teams and the subject and also the details, meaning that all these go through Microsoft in one way or another, meaning Microsoft can read this. So they removed the hybrid configuration. So they just use Outlook and don't use any kind of calendar. They don't utilize the calendar in Teams anymore.
Interesting. Yeah.
Very.
Yeah. So I know that when it comes to the implementation of Microsoft Teams, it's often seen just as a replacement for other third-party video conferencing solutions, and nobody really takes into account that Teams is more than this. And some companies try to start with an approach where they start with either with let's say cloud-only accounts, right? Just to get Teams and the functionality of a calendar, because you need to coordinate those meetings in some way, right? And we know that, yes, sure, you can start with cloud-only accounts, but after a certain time, there's so much data already in those cloud-only accounts. How do you want to clear them up and connect them to hybrid identities and hybrid mailboxes? This is just crazy.
Yeah, we were looking at that option in the beginning, but we said, like, me and another colleague, like, basically said, like, okay, because they started to basically their computers were also hybrid joined because they clicked that button when connecting. So now we had computers that was into this tenant, and we like, okay, we need to steer this up the correct way. So we created this hybrid identities and put conditional access in place. So their computers would be hybrid joined. And put controls there, so they could just connect with their identities with MFA and stuff like that, right? So we did that the correct way, securely. But that way also, like, it was kind of a little bit of a mess because they're very, looking for high security, and they don't really want anything like, they don't even want Microsoft to be able, being able at all to look at their data they're having, and it's very hard with a cloud service. So
yes, I normally try to explain that using a cloud service is about trust, and it's not only with cloud service but any other third-party technology vendor that you use. So let's say just a data center provider where you outsource your hardware to. It's mostly the same thing, and you need to need to consider the contractual agreement that you do, and there's all this fuzzy thing about but it's Microsoft, right? And technically, it's not stated in the contracts, but I believe they can read. And the data is transferred in between. It's still keeps your data, and it's all of those. I already heard that. Okay, this calendar information it's synchronized, right? So there's a copy of it in the cloud. There's another.
But there shouldn't any copy, there shouldn't be any cache somewhere, as far as I understood, from their data.
Yeah, so this even if you do have a on-prem mailbox, there's something called that is a shadow mailbox in the cloud for e-discovery stuff. That we're to, and as soon as I talk about the shadow mailbox, this is synchronized to the shadow mailbox, so it's in the cloud with Microsoft anyway. So okay, this is where I need to explain this on a very detailed level. But as soon as you start explaining this stuff on a very technical detail level, just to show that certain assumptions are not the case, customers tend to just, they just blend out, and it's too technical for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's not used for like storing any. It's for example, it's the chat that the meeting chat is stored in the cloud mailbox, isn't it?
No, it's you have to differentiate between the conversation in your teams, right, which is then part of the team mailbox, or your private chat, right?
Yeah, exactly. But what I'm thinking is, like, for compliance, teams on an on-premises mailbox, the compliance records go to this shadow mailbox.
Yeah, so you do have to differentiate between compliance regarding your compliance requirements regarding email. This is why your email mailbox stays on-prem.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's the compliance part for Teams, which in this case uses a shadow mailbox because the Teams information is then, or your Teams activities are searchable using eDiscovery Search as a cloud service of M365, because eDiscovery and compliance from a cloud perspective is across all workloads. It's not just Exchange.
Yeah, and maybe you can answer this, because they wanted retention on the meeting chat, basically private chat. It's what meeting chats are there. It's not differentiate between the private and meeting chat, but they have a retention policy for that. And I know that it basically removes these records from the shadow mailbox then, and then aggregates this up to the Azure, where they are stored as well, the messages, right?
Right.
For instance. But do you need the shadow mailbox in order to apply a retention policy? Does it go straight up to the Azure instance and remove the chats from the Teams client, or because you need to, in order to get the shed on Mailbox, right, you need to also license the user for Exchange Online in order for the shed on Mailbox to be applied, as far as I understand.
That's my understanding as well.
Yeah. It's not easy.
No, it's not easy, and I currently I'm in a project with a large in the automotive industry, and they started with something called a Teams Lite approach, and even wanted to use Microsoft Teams without SharePoint and OneDrive.
Yeah. That's what they do as well. They don't have any SharePoint or OneDrive licenses at all. Like, it's the same SharePoint license, obviously, OneDrive as well, but they have that off. So they can't use the files, attach files or something like. They can't use PowerPoint Live in meetings either, for example, because that needs OneDrive. I mean, it do work. They can have meetings and stuff like that. They do work, but there's limitations, and they can't use the Teams client at all. They have to use Outlook for everything to schedule meetings, to connect to meetings. The chat will disappear, so they can't get back to it. The chat is also removed because they're still in island mode, because they want to schedule Skype meetings as well. So you have to manually remove the actual button and then put retention policies for other like meeting chat. So basically, they have to connect to the meeting to get into the chat again, because there's no chat button, and then they can get around that by actually mentioning someone. And then we get to the activity tab, and from there you can access the chat from the activity tab if you're
Wow.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of
I wonder how companies explain this from an end user experience perspective, right? Because that does not enhance adoption.
Yeah, I mean, from an end user experience, it's not a great experience. It's not, but whatever. What are you gonna do if they say like, yeah, but we have the strict policies right now. We're not storing anything in the cloud and this and that, and we want to accomplish this in a secure way. I mean, you do that, but you make sure also to explain the cons with it, and that it's the experience overall is going to be worse in all aspects, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I would say, because it's when you talk about Microsoft Teams and you see the other workloads or work streams in Microsoft 365 that a company uses, as I wonder why they are so restrictive when it comes to Teams, and they use other components without those constraints. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, they don't always make sense. That's for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else who does have a question, want to comment or talk about Microsoft Teams and on-prem resources? Okay, if not, I just want to say thank you for attending my session today, and hope you enjoy the CloudEight conference, the third edition of it, and head back to the homepage and see which other sessions come up next at 12 o'clock. Enjoy. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.